Welcome to Page and Screen with John Paul Sarney. As always, I'm thrilled you've joined me, and you can watch this on YouTube. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcast. And you can shop the store with every book from every guest on bookshop.org/page and screen, which supports independent booksellers. Now, on today's episode, we are looking at the work of one of America's grandest filmmakers, Martin Scorsese. From Raging Bull to Goodfellas, The Departed, and The Wolf of Wall Street, Scorsese has an inimitable style and careful eye when it comes to his characters across all 26 of his films to date. Though his inspirations from the early years and the breadth of his work may surprise you when you look at the collection in one fell swoop. Ian Nathan is one of the UK's best known film writers, having written 9 previous books covering iconic filmmakers and directors across the world. His newest book is Martin Scorsese, the iconic filmmaker and his work, which is available now from White Lion Publishing. Ian, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, to begin, we have to talk about Martin Scorsese is almost his own genre, really, at this point. And a lot of cinephiles who have come to know his work over the years in the past decades probably have a good sense as to who he is as a person, his family, his upbringing, his sense of New York from his life and his childhood. How closely in reality did his formative years in New York resemble the stories that he would eventually be telling on screen?
Well, it's almost like something of a cliche, isn't it, to say that a director, certainly a director we consider an auteur, invests their own life into their work. But I think with Scorsese, it's almost indivisible, and not just in the sense of the films he's made, but how he himself has spoken about those films. Is that he readily addresses this point and says, "Well, these are the things from my youth I put into those films." You know, his early work, especially if you go back to, Who's That Knocking at the Door, to Mean Streets, are effectively fictions built out of autobiographical sketches. They are born of the people he knew, the worlds he inhabited, Elizabeth Street in New York, where he grew up, the mafia he witnessed, and the reality of those places were invested into those films very directly. And that process, that idea of illuminating his own work, his own fictional work, with the reality as he understands it and has experienced it, has become the methodology right through the career. So you can make films as diverse as Kundun, New York, The Departed, which you mentioned, Killers of a Flower Moon, which are very, removed from what you might think of as Scorsese's world, the New York world. Yet they are still invested with that personality and that idea and that sense of self, which makes him an incredibly personal filmmaker.
He really is. And I mean, I think that part of that comes from, if you look across his CV, there are these kind of almost like, triptychs and quartets with different actors that he's worked with. So he has this, groupings of leading men over the years. Like there's certainly Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio, but since you mentioned the early films, going through the book, I mean, I was looking at some of the photos because the book is covered in photos from the films, some of the original posters, and one of his earliest, I think, his earliest leading man was Harvey Keitel, who I probably the first film that I saw Harvey Keitel in, and I'm sure I was too young to see this movie at the time, was Bad Lieutenant, which I think was an NC-17, pretty racy movie. But this photo you have in the book, and if you're watching on YouTube, of Harvey Keitel, young Harvey Keitel, is just absolutely incredible. He looks like I don't know, he just looks like a French matinee idol. So tell me a little bit about that, these first couple of films, because they took a long time. He started in black and white. He was studying
Yeah.
the Europeans. It's a different kind of world than some people might know of from his later work.
Yeah, exactly. The kind of journey from altar boy, would-be priest to filmmaker. Again, it's a legend. So Scorsese has spoken a lot about this. Obviously, comes from the fact that he was an asthmatic as a child, couldn't go out in the streets, wasn't sporty, didn't run with the gangs. That would have led maybe to a life more Goodfellas than than the one he did lead. And the one time his parents could get him out of the house in relative safety for a asthmatic boy, and he was seriously asthmatic, was to take him to the movies. And the movies became this great sort of outlet and escape route. And I think Scorsese would admit he has an obsessive personality. So movies became an addiction, if you want. Addiction is a theme and a reality that runs through his career as well. And that was the path eventually that took him. There's a kind of simpler way of looking at it and going, he could have been a priest, he could have been a gangster, or he could have been a filmmaker. And the filmmaker kind of mixes the priest and gangster together, and the themes of his films are that. And I mean, that simplifies things greatly. But he went to New York University, he studied film, and that became the religion. And the way he started to make films was very influenced by both the French New Wave, and it was influenced by John Cassavetes, that he would make films that were essentially slices of life. I mean, this is a very pragmatic choice in some ways. When you have no money as a student, trying to borrow the equipment from the college and get your friends to help, you can't make a big gangster movie. You make what you can make. And the early shorts, experimental as they are, reveal this sense of slice of life. And he got to the stage where he wanted to make a feature film. And that was Who's That Knocking at My Door became, really an assemblage of early experiments. He shot it over, I think, 4 years. And if you watch closely, you can see Harvey Keitel, his leading man, sort of age quite rapidly within it. And it was really his story. It was Scorsese's story. It was an autobiographical sketch about coming of age in lower Manhattan. And love and gangsters and all the things that were part of Scorsese's ephemera are put into that. But the style is crucial because it is all about Catholicism. It is all about, friendships and youth and the kind of garrulous way they behave on the streets in quite a sort of naturalistic way. There's not very little plot in the first film. It's more an impressionistic view of life, but very kind of very forceful. And within that, as you say, Harvey Keitel was the avatar of the young Scorsese, and he really just looked for a young actor who wasn't, was affordable more than anything. And he'd come across Keitel, and who was, I think, working at the same time as he was, trying to be an actor. He wasn't yet established himself. And as much as we talk about De Niro, and rightly so, as much as we talk about DiCaprio later on as the kind of great muses, I think it starts with Keitel. And I think the important film for me is Mean Streets, in the sense that Mean Street is the kind of the agenda. It's the blueprint, really. For before that, it was a kind of a searching and a sort of setting of up of things. Mean Street sets the template, and it's really crucial that within that film, it's Keitel who plays the Scorsese character, and De Niro plays the kind of sort of outrageous kind of sidekick character, the doom-laden Johnny. And so, absolutely, Keitel is the first muse. He is the first kind of version of Scorsese, and that's significant for me. And he's much more of a movie star in some senses, as you say, than De Niro. Very early on, he looks very handsome. He's very captivating, and is a different kind of quality. So, while we should look to De Niro as the kind of great Scorsese alter ego, Keitel is just as important.
Yeah, I mean, especially at the beginning, and then it's interesting because there is this overlap, and we go from Keitel over to De Niro, and then De Niro is, probably for a lot of people that don't live and work in the film world, one of the most recognizable films from the early Scorsese years would be Taxi Driver. And now, Taxi Driver, as you write about in the book, was made in a very particular moment in America. So the Vietnam War was going on, and you described the city of New York as being on the verge of bankruptcy financially and morally. So how did this film come into being and reflect the time that it was made?
Yeah, I mean, Taxi Driver, obviously now we look back on it and it's seen as a kind of a signal moment in American cinema. It's seen as maybe the flagship of new Hollywood. It's surely still the defining film in Scorsese's career. As many masterpieces as there's been, as many great movies as there's been. But I think the crucial thing about Taxi Driver is that, in a sense, it isn't really Scorsese's film. And I don't mean to say he didn't direct it. Of course he did. And it's full of Scorsese and full of, all the things he wanted to explore. But it comes from Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader was a screenwriter and a very particular individual living at a very dark time in his life when he'd split up, and he was living in Hollywood, but he split up from a girlfriend. And he was kind of leading a life that was very similar to Travis Bickle in the film. I mean, he wasn't, potentially a killer, but he saw that in himself. He channeled a dark side of himself and wrote this astonishing script that he pitched to Brian De Palma. And of course, Brian De Palma knew Scorsese, and it's a point where the kind of movie brats, if you want to call them that, were kind of getting together in Hollywood. And this was very much a story generated, or a film generated in Hollywood, although it's the great New York film. It was, created in Hollywood. And De Palma didn't make it he went off to make something different. I mean, we can argue on a totally different podcast about De Palma's choices in his career. He let the great ones go and followed the wrong ones. But De Palma suggested Scorsese. And that's, Schrader had been a film journalist and written this script, got together with Scorsese, and Scorsese got it. He understood something in that screenplay, answered something in himself that he wants to explore, this dark side, this idea of the dark side of America, the idea of post-Vietnam America. And of course, it was set in New York, and he understood New York perhaps better than any contemporary director did. He had seen New York in this. Its decline in the 70s, the kind of rise of crime, beyond just the mafia into this kind of, these sleazy, terrible streets of Manhattan at that time. I mean, the film captures that in almost a kind of horror movie vibe. And Scorsese could see straight away. And it became a sort of, I call it the unholy trinity, which is a bit of a gaudy way of saying it. But the third part of that was De Niro, who also fully understood Travis Bickle. I mean, the character answered something in all of them. Schrader, Scorsese, and De Niro. It sort of spoke to something they all were wrestling with. And it spoke to this idea that cinema had awoken from the studio system where everything was happy endings and, audience appeal and, in good and bad ways, everything had a kind of commerciality built into it. The new Hollywood thing was, how can we use film to explore reality, explore America, explore what was happening, Watergate, in Vietnam, in this sense of, can we trust, the whole concept of America anymore? And Travis Bickle was the kind of focus of that and the channeling of that. And between the three of them, they created this extraordinary film. And one of the amazing things, it was a film I started with, and since I went back and watched them all, but I started with Taxi Driver. And what occurred to me as I watched it again, and I hadn't seen it for a few years, was what a kind of slick film it was. What a stylish film it was. That incredible Bernard Herrmann score, which sort of suggests something, swaggering, as much as it is a story of this psychological breakdown, this outsider figure, this guy who cannot function in modern society. There was something very movie-ish about it that I thought, oh yeah, I mean, Scorsese sort of filters everything, I think, through the prism of cinema. That cinema answers all the questions he has. If he's going to express himself, he'll refer to a movie as the example of that thing he wants to say. So what I adore about Taxi Driver is that it says all these incredibly dark things about America. It speaks to its moment very powerfully. But above all, it does it through the medium of movie. The shots at the very beginning of the cab sort of appearing out of that kind of Stygian smoke, which you suddenly think, am I watching a horror movie rather than a thriller or a psychological exploration? The answer is yes, it's all those things. But that, so it's a kind of what's coming to being, I think, in Taxi Driver is the majesty of Scorsese's filmmaking. All the things that make him him, the psychological exploration, the reality, the dark characters, the lack of moral kind of poles or certainties in the universe, but matched by this glorious sense of the medium and what the medium can do.
And it really just announces him in a very confident way onto the scene as a proper filmmaker, and so much so that after, was it just a couple weeks after this film came out, after Taxi Driver came out, he took out an ad in Variety, at like a 2-page ad announcing what his next film was meant to be at that moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing you should say about Taxi Driver is no one expected it to be the success it was. Yeah, New Hollywood is something we always look back on and we sort of retroactively assemble it. I don't think anyone at the time quite had the kind of sense of we're this big movement, we've got all this kind of power. The inmates have taken over the asylum. We now can call the shots as great artists. I think they were still desperately trying to figure it out. They were just filmmakers trying to make their mark and trying to get careers going. And Scorsese absolutely established himself through what happened with Taxi Driver and saw it. He was a pragmatic guy as much as anything. He wanted to make films. He wanted to be successful. He wanted money and fame and all those things that came with it. But the freedom to express himself was a kind of a power that success imbues upon you. And at that point, he was thinking of making Gangs of New York, which was obviously a film he wouldn't make for a long time. But he absolutely wanted to make Gangs of New York at that point to continue this idea of New York as his central film. He didn't make it at that point. It'd be a long while before that carried on. But he then just decided that he wanted to tackle a different genre. He wanted to almost celebrate his own love of kind of Hollywood. It's kind of an irony, I suppose, of Scorsese's career, is that as much as he is an outsider figure, and though he's worked in the studio system, he's apart from it. He's never belonged to it. He's not like Spielberg, his great mate, who has thrived within it. It's always been a very tense relationship between Scorsese and Hollywood. They kind of get on, they kind of don't. Yet Scorsese adores Hollywood, the concept of it, the movie making of it, the history of it. He adores it. And this kind of contradiction has always been something he's wrestled with, I think, and it's there in his films. So the next film he chooses to make of Taxi Driver is a musical, New York, New York. But it's a musical made in Hollywood, even though it's called New York, New York, about Hollywood. Yet he just tried to make a musical using all the kind of filmmaking ideas and techniques he'd used in Mean Streets and Taxi Driver. So in some ways, if you said to me, name a film that expresses everything about Scorsese as a filmmaker, and I would say New York, New York is the answer to that. Not because it's the most successful, because it's quite a flawed film, but it says everything about him, that he wants to try, this kind of most flamboyant control of mediums and genres in the musical, but use his kind of raw psychological, extended improvisational techniques to do it. Those two things don't necessarily mesh, but the film is fascinating because of that. So in a sense, if you want to learn about who Scorsese is, New York, New York is a very good place to start.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at all of them, and we're going to talk in a minute about some of the other ones that, again, veer off course a little bit from what seems like it might be the next thing. But I think it's also important to remember that with all writers and directors and everyone who works in the creative world, there are these projects that we kind of drag around with us for decades until we get them made, because we love them so much, and you're waiting for the opportunity or the financing or whatever it might be. And like you said, like Gangs of New York would come much later at a much different sort of price point, but before then, as we're moving towards that moment, the one of the big shifts in his career that you talk about, in especially in as it concerns the world of proper Hollywood, was the color of money. And so I'm just curious about like how this one came into his orbit as well, because this is, again, it feels like not maybe the next thing, but how does this
Yeah.
whole thing come into being? And also, he's with Paul Newman, he's then with sort of a bona fide movie star. someone that is a bigger name on the poster than his at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look across the career, you could see, maybe with the exception of Boxcar Bertha, which was a film made for Roger Corman and made because Scorsese wanted to make a film and had no other opportunities. The only other film in his career that can be categorized as not a Scorsese film, he isn't the first name you think of when you look at that project, is The Color of Money. It didn't begin with him. It was a studio project. It was Paul Newman. It was a sequel to The Hustler of a sort. It was a very distant sequel from The Hustler, which is a very early Paul Newman film about Paul Shark, a very famous film, which Scorsese obviously knew very well. But it began, separate from Scorsese. In a sense, this is the only time Scorsese's been brought on. We can argue maybe about Cape Fear, but I think still Cape Fear was a Scorsese project. But this is Color of Money is the only time where Scorsese is essentially a director for hire. I don't want to sort of demean the film or demean Scorsese by saying that, because I think he would agree that he came on out of a kind of curiosity. Paul Newman had called him and he said, I think you're the guy who can get this performance out of me and the performance the film needs. You're the guy who understands this world. Scorsese, I think, was quite intrigued and flattered by that concept. I think the other thing you have to remember is that even for Martin Scorsese, it's really hard to get films made. It's really hard to win over studios. He still battles to this day to get what he needs to make a film. You think, the guy's got the best reputation in the whole of the medium, but yet he still struggles. So the opportunity literally to make a film, to break that tension of trying and trying and trying to get a film made, is an enormous attraction. And I think The Color of Money marks that. I mean, once he'd agreed with Newman that he was going to do it, he almost threw everything out that they already had and started again. Richard Price wrote the screenplay, and they both really wanted to look at the kind of the world of pool sharks, these kind of dingy kind of pool halls in kind of Rust Belt America, and this kind of sense of trajectory of a journey across, a different kind of America. In a way, a reflection of Scorsese's interpretations of the mafia. It's kind of belongs a little to that kind of subgenre of Scorsese films. But it's a star vehicle. I think that's what's remarkable about it. And I don't think Scorsese has ever really worked on a film in which a sense it's about the stars other than Color of Money. De Niro is his muse and sort of grew up with him. DiCaprio was someone who fitted in to Scorsese's world. Late career, it's very much about Scorsese, working with big names. The point with Color of Money, it was big names were already involved and Scorsese came on. Tom Cruise comes into it as the young kind of hustler, the kind of mentor-mentee relationship is established. But when you watch that film, you do stop and have to remind yourself, oh, yeah, it's a Scorsese film, isn't it? I forgot. You tend to think of it immediately as a Paul Newman film, right. Which makes it very interesting. And it is Scorsese. Once you start kind of like delving into it, you can see the taste of Scorsese, but it's the distant one. It's a little bit removed from him.
It is, and also another one that's removed, and by the way, any of these films could be their own entire podcast episode to talk about them, and it's really fascinating, and you go through so much of it in the book, which is wonderful. But I want to get to the one we have to talk about is Goodfellas, because this is very much in the world. But leading up to Goodfellas, and we can't. There's a lot to talk about, but we can't quite get on the Last Temptation of Christ. But that film is it premiering at the Venice Film Festival when Scorsese bumps into in the lobby, is it Ray Liotta, I think, who approaches him, and he's got bodyguards all around him because Last Temptation of Christ was a very controversial film.
Yeah.
And Ray Liotta at the time, unbeknownst to Scorsese, just walks up to him and I think it was part of that approach that got him interested, that got Scorsese interested in Liotta for that role.
Oh, completely. I mean, obviously, the Last Temptation of Christ is his whole story and this kind of lifelong project, this passion project that had led him into great difficulties, not only with the studios, but with the religious right of America. So
Yeah.
he was a little bit of a targeted guy on whatever level at that time.
And he probably needed a win after that.
And needed a win. It's a different debate, but there's always that kind of passion projects can, lead you down dark alleys, and director for hire or, spontaneous projects can be enormously successful. Taxi Driver was more spontaneous. Goodfellas had that tincture of, I'll just do this because I get it. And it turns out to be one of the greatest films. I think he needs that spontaneity. I think that works for Scorsese. But anyway, with Goodfellas, which obviously was in some ways a very personal film in that it reflected a world he knew growing up. He knew De Niro was too old to play the Henry Hill character, so he marked him out for the character of Jimmy. Joe Pesci was someone he'd worked with on Raging Bull and knew very well, and already marked him out. But he couldn't find his Henry Hill. He couldn't find the lead character whose story it is. The guy who turned on his mob bosses and went into witness protection and tells a story. A real person is a real story. And Liotta tells this kind of story. Liotta wanted it so badly. He understood the character. He was desperate for it and hungered for it. So he took a risk, not just in terms of embarrassing himself in front of Scorsese, but literally, risk of getting beaten by the bodyguards and you're pulled aside as some kind of mad stalker. But Liotta took that chance. And Scorsese did know who he was once it got past the barricades of security. And Scorsese says that there was a kind of parallel between Liotta's desperation and eagerness and a hunger to be in this kind of movie, and the character of Henry Hill he wanted to portray. Both the young man won over by the glamour of the lifestyle, and it's a film about lifestyle, Goodfellas, and also the desperate man who basically breaks down and becomes an informant for the FBI. So he saw probably in that one meeting all the sides and all the shades of Henry Hill that he needed and cast accordingly. And it works. It works perfectly. Liotta, in some ways, we always talk about that film. We remember Joe Pesci and we love De Niro, the camera moving up the bar and the dead eyes and all that fabulous stuff. But the engine of Goodfellas is Ray Liotta, and he drives the kind of energy, that kind of wired energy that the film has. So he's terrific in that movie.
And when you talk about it in the book, you mention, which comes up in a few different times in the different films, his incredible attention to detail. Scorsese's attention to detail on the set. And is it true that Scorsese insisted on like tying Ray Liotta's tie when he was getting dressed because there was a specific way that he wanted it, like that
Yeah.
level of detail?
Oh, it was incredible how obsessive Scorsese was about, getting this world right. And it's a world, as I say, he knew. He knew it from staring out the window on Elizabeth Street, looking at Goodfellas, hanging out on the street, the rituals, the language, the dress, the codes. This was what the film is about. As I say, it's a film about lifestyle, and everything mattered in that respect. He often talks about being an anthropologist, Scorsese. That's part of his filmmaking kind of method, that he analyzes types of people. And it's a good sort of way of looking at all his films. And especially in Goodfellas, it was an anthropology of gangsters, not from the big Godfather level, but from the kind of low street level that he understood. So he understood, he knew gangsters, so he understood how they tied their ties, how unnecessary that was, what a badge that was. All the touches, in some ways it was very organized, it was very spontaneous, improvised film, Goodfellas. The touches of like the incredible tracking shot we all know of Liotta entering the club through the kitchen and handing out money, and it's one incredible shot, again, iconic. But the detail at the end of the table being brought in from nowhere was something Scorsese had remembered. You click your finger, the guy would click his fingers and the table would be brought around and all the other faces would look inward. That film has actually got very few close-ups in it because Scorsese constantly wanted these characters to be in the context of the world around them. We had to view them through this idea of the world they're in and the other people around them. It was about a society within society. So all those details were absolutely vital to creating the kind of richness and texture of the world.
There's so much more to talk about, which we couldn't possibly get into all of it today. I mean, there's even things like The Age of Innocence,
Yeah.
Hugo from Hugo Cabaret. There's so many wonderful things. But in closing, I just did want to say that Scorsese. We begin in the book. You take us through his years at NYU and learning about filmmaking. And I've only met him once in my life, and he was very kind. He came to a film festival that I was working at called First Time Fest in New York City at the Players Club in New York. It was only for first time filmmakers that my friends Joanna Bennett and Mandy Ward were running. And he sat with all of these kids who were late teens, early 20s, and beginning their careers. And he was so generous and wonderful with his time and wanting to teach. And you can tell from his films and when he talks about films and when he meets young filmmakers that he loves the cinema and the history of cinema and the future of cinema and all of the hopes therein. So this, I think, is a wonderful book to remember all of the films thus far and also what's left to come, because he's certainly not done yet. But Ian, Nathan, thank you so much for being here. But tell us before you go, if people want to get a copy of your book in an independent bookshop somewhere, is there a place that you like? Where do you send people to pick up a book like this?
Well, see, I live in the UK. You can probably hear from my accent that I'm English. So I know English bookshops better than I know American ones. I mean, one of my great joys in life is wandering around bookshops in New York. So if you are a New Yorker, I think it'd be appropriate you find your local independent bookstore there. I love Book Soup in LA. They've always been very good to me. They've kind of always put my books on display. And so if you're an LA resident, then please go there. And if you're a London, you're European resident, then please track down your local film orientated bookshops. They're the ones obviously I favour.
Excellent. Well, Ian, Nathan, thank you so much for being on Page and Screen with me. Again, the book is Martin Scorsese, the iconic filmmaker and his work. It's wonderful to have you, and we'll be featuring it again when I do the holiday gift guide, which is the next and last episode of Page and Screen for the season. But Ian, thank you so much, and have
Thank
a
you.
wonderful end of the year.